Can everyone hear me? Are we okay if I just speak loudly? Is that all right? Yeah, good. Okay. Thanks very much for coming. I'm here today to talk about something called certificate revocation. This is me. Everything that I talk about today, all the technologies, all of the different things, you can find them on my blog and my Twitter handles up there as well, so please follow me. It's how I judge myself as a person, by my number of followers. But what's not up there is my job title. I usually go by security researcher. I spend a lot of my time doing various bits of research, looking into the security of websites, hardware devices, various bits and bobs, but I do a lot of what a hacker would do, but I don't use the term hacker. I don't really like it. It's a bit of a media buzzword. It also has negative connotations. If you tell people you're a hacker, they usually kind of like start turning their Wi-Fi off at the side. But the main reason is that according to Google image search, I don't look anything like one anyway, so kind of may as well not bother. But I have done a few bits of research. I've got some nice coverage. This is a more recent one, password reset on any electric or gas account for a big provider here in the UK. This was a really good one. Nissan, the app that controls their cars, like in all the functions of your car, they literally copy and pasted code off Stack Overflow because they even left the typo in the code sample on Stack Overflow in their app. The research that I did, I presented at SteelCon a year or so ago now, that I did with Troy Hunt. And of course, the Brightbox router that I got into trouble for blowing up with my shotgun as well. But more recently, I appeared on BBC Click. If you want to know what not to do to build a secure device, watch this episode. If you haven't seen the Nomex most secure email server in the world, you should definitely watch this just for the comedy value. And literally just a couple of weeks ago, Ian mentioned DEF CON. I was really fortunate to spend a lot of time there with Kate, who sat down here at the front. And there's another 2 episodes of Click from DEF CON B-Sides and Black Hat, if you want to have a look at them as well. But I'm here to talk about something that I'm quite fond of. Those of you that have seen me talk before will know that I like HTTPS. I like encryption on the web. And to do that, we all need to go out and get certificates. These are the documents that you have to go and obtain. You used to have to buy them. You can get them largely free now. But you have to go out and get a certificate from a certificate authority if you want to deploy encryption on your website. If you want the little green padlock and all the benefits that come with it, this is what you have to get. And every single day actually, I scan the top 1 million websites on the planet, but every 6 months I produce a report on various different aspects of their security. And every 6 months when I run this now, you can see that the number of sites deploying encryption is going up. So these are all the sites in groups of 4,000 from the top sites in the world down to the last 4,000 in the top million at least. And every time I do this, not only are more and more sites deploying HTTPS, but we're actually increasing the rate at which we're doing it. If I represent that data like this, it's a bit more clear that we're actually accelerating the rate of deployment of encryption on the web. We're deploying encryption on the web right now faster than at any point in history. So we are making some really good progress. Largely in part due to organizations like Let's Encrypt, the free CA, so you don't have to pay for these certificates anymore. In February 2016, just after they launched, as you would expect, they had a fairly low prevalence in the top 1 million sites. But just a year later, they increased their market share massively because we don't have to pay for these anymore. And also, you can fully automate the process with Let's Encrypt. So we took away the cost barrier, and we took away one of the big technical barriers with that as well. So the reason that we have to have certificates, like why do we need to go to one of these organizations and get a certificate? It's because secure communication on the web isn't possible without authentication. We have to be able to prove our identities. And we do that by obtaining a certificate to prove who we are. So if we think of a typical browsing scenario, you open your browser and go to PayPal. And you kind of hope that's PayPal. But if you're talking HTTP, then it's trivially easy for an attacker to intercept and monitor that connection, but also to just impersonate PayPal. They can just say, hey, I'm PayPal, and you have no way to know that they're not. That's why we challenge websites to provide a certificate to prove that they are PayPal.com. This is what we need them for. And the problem that we're trying to solve, you've probably all seen and heard of this before in various different forms, but it's essentially this. On the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog, and that's exactly what certificates fix, this problem of identity. We can prove that we are not a dog. So the process of getting a certificate is really easy. We have our website set up and we send something called a CSR, which is a certificate signing request. It basically just says, I'm scotthelme.co.uk, I want a certificate, here's a few other bits of information. And if we can prove that we own the domain, typically via email, or they will ask us to host a challenge file at a random path, then we satisfy the proof of ownership and the CA will issue us a certificate back. We put that on our server, and then when the browser comes along, we just pass it down to the browser to prove our identity, and we get green HTTPS. Everybody is happy. This is the process at a really high level. And certificates are just text files. There's nothing really fancy in a certificate. They just have various bits of kind of key value pairs of data. The common name, which domain name was this issued to? Who issued it? So the browser can see if they trust the issuing authority. And things like the valid from and to dates as well. It's literally just a text file with a signature at the bottom. Now, the idea of the certificate is we present it out to the browser to prove our identity. But obviously, there has to be something a little bit more to that, because if we just give out the certificate, somebody else could just grab my certificate and then present it and say, I have this certificate, I'm scotthelme.co.uk. You have to have what we call the private key on your server that's associated with it. This is the part that you need to actually use the certificate. And as the name suggests, it's a private key. It's supposed to be known only by you and remain securely and safely on your server. Hands up who has perfect security. Good, nobody. Right. Things, I always said, stuff happens. I'll go with stuff happens. And sometimes keys get lost. We had recently, Heartbleed was probably the most notable example of this. Heartbleed essentially allowed an attacker to just download a copy of your key off your server. So it's no longer a private key. The bad guys can literally just steal a copy of it. Once they get a copy of your key or they obtain it in some way, maybe someone left a laptop on a bus or they broke into one of your servers, it doesn't matter. They've now got your key, which means they can now use your certificate and prove they are you. So you now have somebody on the internet that isn't you that can prove they are you. And this is a really bad place to be, because if this was a certificate for PayPal.com and I could tell people and prove to people I was PayPal.com, that's a really bad situation. So we need revocation. This comes from the talk title. Revocation is the ability to say, something bad happened with this certificate. We need to cancel it. We can't just ask the bad guys to delete it and stop using it. We need a technical measure to say, look, something bad happened to this document. I got hacked, whatever. But we need to no longer trust this particular certificate. So something bad happened, Heartbleed came along, whatever it was. We need to perform a revocation. So we send a revocation request to our CA and say, look, we've had a really bad day. We've been hacked. Somebody's managed to compromise our servers. We need to distrust this certificate. We need to mark it as no longer valid. And the CAs have two mechanisms to do that. The first of these is a CRL. It's called a Certificate Revocation List. And it literally is exactly what it says. It's just a file that is a big list of all certificates that have been requested to be revoked. You can go to a CA and just download one of these and have a look through it. It's just a document with a big list in. The other mechanism is something called OCSP. This is the Online Certificate Status Protocol. And this differs slightly from a CRL, because a CRL is just a honking big file with everything in it. With OCSP, what you do to the responder is you say, is this particular certificate valid, yes or no? So rather than downloading a massive big file, you just ask a yes-no question about one particular certificate. So the idea being here is that when you've been compromised and the bad guy is trying to use your certificate, what the browsers actually do in the background is when they get that certificate, they will check its status to see if it is revoked. So the browser, historically, they used to use the CRL. So it would get a certificate and it says, right, I've just got this certificate. I need to know if this is good or bad. So it would go download a copy of the CRL. It would then look through that list to see if the certificate's on it. If the certificate's on it, it's bad, it's revoked, and the browser knows not to trust it. So we get the CRL, we see the cert, it's bad, and it closes the connection and said, this certificate is revoked, I'm not going to accept it. We're safe. Similarly with OCSP, it's essentially exactly the same thing that happens again, except with the OCSP responder, like I said, it's a simple yes-no question. So the browser actually sends the serial number for the certificate and says, is this particular certificate valid? And the OCSP responder responds back and says it's either good or bad. We essentially get a yes-no answer on whether or not we can use it. So if the OCSP response comes back and says revoked, again, the browser will reject the document. It won't accept it, and it will close the connection. So we can protect ourselves if we lose this certificate. Now, the only problem the browser has is every time it sees a certificate, it doesn't know whether or not it's actually coming from me or from a bad guy, whether it's been stolen. So the idea is that the browser kind of has to check the status of the certificate all the time, because we could have checked it yesterday, it could have been revoked last night, and if we see it again today, we need to check again because it could have been revoked since the last time we saw it. So it doesn't matter whether we have been compromised or not, the browser always needs to perform these checks. There is some cache period in there, so it's not too aggressive, but we have to frequently check the revocation status. Now, if you go to a website, you get the certificate, and you reach out to one of these revocation servers, what happens if they look like this? What should your browser do if the revocation infrastructure is down? Maybe your CA is being DDoSed offline. Maybe someone turned off the data center by accident. It doesn't really matter. You reach out to the servers and they're not there. What should the browser do? Now, this isn't the only problem with revocation. This is the obvious problem of the infrastructure being offline. But there are some other drawbacks to revocation as well. I talked about the certificate revocation list being that big file with a list of all revoked certificates in it. How big do you think that might be? Someone shout out a number, guess. What do we think? Because we have to download this. When we go to a website, we have to go and download this other file before we can connect. So this stops us loading the web page. What if that was like a 50 kilobyte file? That's not too bad. Maybe it hits 500K. We're now pulling down a half meg file just to load Facebook. What if it hits a meg? What if it hits 10 meg? What if it hit 50 meg? Or like earlier this year, one of Apple's CRLs hit 90 meg in size. Do you want to pull down a 90 meg file when you open Facebook? And the answer is no. CRLs were largely abandoned a long time ago for this problem and many other problems as well. OCSP replaced CRLs because we like this idea of the simple yes-no question. You make a very small request and you get a very small response. From a performance standpoint, it's great. Does anyone know what the problem with OCSP is? Can anyone guess what the problem is? Exactly. There is a massive, massive privacy concern with OCSP because when you reach out to the responder to check the status of a particular certificate, the question that you ask is this. Do I really want to be asking a third-party organization that every time I go to this website? And the answer is no, because you're now leaking your entire browsing history to some third-party organization that you probably don't even know about. You send the serial number for the certificate, and of course the CA knows who they issued that to. So they can say, all right, great, this guy's about to go to this particular website because he's just asked for the status of the certificate, so he must be about to go to that website. So all of these problems coupled together led to what we call soft fail revocation checking. So historically, if the infrastructure was down or there was some kind of problem, the browser would just say, nope, I give up. I can't check the status of the certificate. But we moved to something called soft fail, where the browsers would do a best effort revocation check. So they would try and check the revocation status when they got a certificate. The only problem was, if they couldn't do it for some reason, say the CA was down, you don't want your CA to go offline and pull your site down. So if it looks like the CA is down or offline, the browser would just say, oh, well, they're not there, so we'll just carry on. Now, how hard do you think it is, if you're an attacker, especially on the network, to simulate your CA being offline? All the attacker has to do, all the bad guy has to do is this. If they see your browser try and make a revocation request, they block that request. And the browser goes, oh, well, the CA must be down. They must be having a bad day, so I'll not bother. I'll carry on. This is what we call soft fail revocation checking. And all of the major browser vendors switched to this years ago. We've been doing soft fail revocation checking for a long time. And the only problem with soft fail revocation checking is it's kind of pointless. Because if the attacker can block the check and the browser will skip it, the attacker will block it every time because they know the browser will carry on and not throw any warnings. The best analogy for this that I heard was from someone that I know at Google called Adam Langley. And he said that soft fail revocation checking is a seatbelt that snaps in a car crash. You get into your car every single day and drive to work and you put your seatbelt on and it does nothing for you. But that one time when you come to depend on the mechanism, it snaps and you go out the window. So all of the rest of the time when we were using it was completely pointless, and the one time we need it is the one time it will fail. This is soft fail revocation checking. This is what happens right now today. So because of the performance overhead of reaching out and making these external requests and waiting to see if the responder's there or not, what actually happens now today in Chromium is this. This is what the revocation check looks like in Chrome right now today. They don't even bother. They don't do it. Chrome browser does not do any form of revocation checking for a certificate because it's pointless. Soft fail revocation checking is totally useless. And this is a real problem because as more and more of us get more and more certificates, if you lose one, you can't do anything about it. You have to live with that loss. There's no way for you to take it back and undo the damage that has been done. Revocation is broken. Firefox are also looking at completely abandoning revocation checking later this year. Right now, they have a 3-second timeout on the check. So you open a page in Firefox, if the OCSP responder doesn't respond within 3 seconds, it will skip it and carry on. But now they're saying, well, we might just join Google and follow Chrome and just completely abandon it. That could be here later this year in Firefox. And then that'll be the two mainstream browsers that don't even do checks. So we need to fix this. We need a solution to the problem of revocation because these certificates, they are important documents and they carry a lot of power. We need to be able to undo our mistakes. So the first step in kind of the solution to the problem was Chrome and Firefox both built proprietary mechanisms into their browsers. They're called CRL sets and OneCRL. And what these vendors do independently of each other is they reach out to the CRL servers for every certificate authority on the planet. So they go to all the different CAs and they pull down the latest copy of their CRL and they merge them into one giant big file, which is the list of all revoked certificates ever. And it sounds really good up until this point, but then what they do is they only select high-value certificates, as they call them, which means that I'm never going to get my certificate in there, none of you will, and nobody that you know will. These are literally trimmed down. You can go look at Firefox's because it's open. They're literally trimmed down to just a few hundred certificates from the many hundreds of megabytes of lists on the internet. So whilst they're really good, you know, maybe Facebook would get theirs in here or maybe PayPal would, but they're largely just for CA certificates, really high value certificates, unfortunately, because they don't want to embed a really large file into the browser. So these lists are trimmed so heavily, they're no use to me or you. The next option that we have a while back to try and fix the privacy issue with OCSP that we talked about, where you're asking for the status of a certificate, there was something created called OCSP Stapling. Now, in OCSP, the browser reaches out to the responder and asks for the status. That's the privacy leak. We're asking for the status for the certificate for Pornhub.com. So what we do with OCSP Stapling is the browser doesn't actually make that request. Instead, our server makes the request and fetches the OCSP response from the OCSP responder. And it's called stapling because the idea is we then staple that together with our certificate. So we get the certificate, the OCSP response, staple them together and give them to the client and say, I've already been to get the OCSP response for you. And we send them both down to the browser. And at first glance, that sounds kind of weird because we're almost self-certifying our revocation status, but the OCSP response is signed in exactly the same way that our certificate is signed. So just like the browser can look at our certificate and say, this is a legitimate document, it can also look at the OCSP response and say, this is also a legitimate document. So there's no concerns from like a fraud or forgery point of view there. And we've stopped the browser doing that privacy leaking OCSP request. The only problem with OCSP stapling is it's optional. Now, if the bad guy has a revoked certificate, are they going to turn on OCSP stapling and say, hey, here's a certificate and also here's the revocation notice, so don't accept it? They're not going to do it. OCSP stapling is a performance enhancement, and the bad guys aren't going to turn this on. So next up, we have a new flag. This is really new. Firefox is the only browser that supports this right now, actually, because it's so new. And it's called OCSP must staple. And you can probably kind of guess where this is going from the name. So when we go to the CA and request our certificate, you can now ask that they set a special flag inside the certificate, and it's called the OCSP must staple flag. And when the browser receives that certificate, if this flag is set, the browser must require an OCSP staple to have been served with the document. Otherwise, it will reject the document and not accept it. So that's how simple it is. We ask them to set the flag goes in, and when the browser gets it, it knows that the OCSP staple has to be served with it. OCSP Staple Extension, it just looks like this. We had our certificate that we saw earlier, and we literally just get an extra piece of text in there. Like I said, certificates are just text files. So we just add a new flag in that says OCSP must staple is enabled for this certificate. So if we then take that and think about this combined with OCSP stapling, we now have a situation where we have to enable OCSP stapling, but that means the bad guys also have to enable OCSP stapling if they try to use our certificate. So we can do this perfectly fine. We fetch the OCSP response and we staple it. If we switch this situation to the bad guy now goes to the OCSP responder, we've revoked it, so the OCSP response is bad. It says the certificate is revoked. So the bad guy has two choices. They can serve the certificate without this response, which means the browser will reject it, or they can serve it with the OCSP response, which means the browser will reject it. So both scenarios, the bad guy can no longer use our certificate because they have to provide the revocation status with it, or the browser will decline to accept it. Now this is literally brand new this year. As I said, Firefox is the only browser that currently supports this. And this is literally the only way right now that we can actually have reliable revocation of our certificates. If you lose a certificate right now, today, and you don't have the must staple flag set, there's nothing you can do about it. And these things can be valid for up to 3 years. If you get one of those and lose it in the first month, you've got 2 years and 11 months with which a bad guy can run around on the internet and pretend to be you and you can't stop them. So I think this is going to be a really important kind of step in our process to fixing revocation. But this is all good and well, but this only applies to certificates that we know about. If we are compromised and we lose a certificate and we know about it, we can ask for it to be revoked. What if somebody manages to trick a CA into issuing a certificate to them? This is called misissuance. It happens every now and again, and it's where we saw an incident 2014, I think it was, with DigiNotar, where somebody actually hacked into the CA systems and issued themselves a lot of certificates for Google.com. Google can't request revocation of those certificates if they don't know they exist. That's a problem because somebody's issued them sneakily or hacked a CA, or maybe it's someone inside your organization that's got a certificate through improper channels. But there is the very real possibility that you can go and get one of these documents and the organization may not be aware of its existence. So we need more transparency in the ecosystem. If a certificate is issued for our domain, we need to know about it because that's ours. And right now, you can't. So there's something new coming. It was originally coming October this year, but unfortunately, after pressure from the wider community, the deadline has been backed off to April next year, called Certificate Transparency. And it aims to completely resolve this situation where right now, someone could get a certificate for your domain and you wouldn't know about it. If you don't know about it, you can't take any action. So the idea with CT, there's 3 different ways that we can do this. The CAs have their original infrastructure to maintain, and it adds an additional requirement for them. It's called a CT log. This is the Certificate Transparency log. It's a completely publicly accessible open log. Anybody can go and view these logs, and the requirement will be that every time a CA issues a certificate, they have to write an entry into this log to say, I've just issued a certificate for PayPal.com, here is a copy of the cert. And they are required to put that in there. So we can now monitor these logs and have full transparency about everything that a CA is doing. These are really powerful organizations. They can issue certificates for any domain in the world. We should have had this level of transparency in the ecosystem a long time ago, but we don't, and it's now on the way. Now, anyone can submit to a CT log. The idea is that when your CA issues a certificate, they will write it into the log. And when you do that, you get something back to prove that you've put it there. It's called an SCT, which is a signed certificate timestamp. So you go, here you go, Mr. Log Operator, here is a certificate to go in the log, and the log gives you back a proof that you've done that. This is your document to say, I have definitely put this certificate in this log, here is my proof. But it doesn't have to be the CA that does that. You can do this as the operator of the site, or literally one of us could just sit here on our laptops now and go submit a certificate to a CT log. They're completely open append-only logs. But we need to prove to the browser that certificates have gone into CT logs, because the browser needs to know, is this a publicly known about certificate? This hasn't been issued in some shady deal. It's not the result of a website being compromised like a CA. We need to prove to the browser when we give it a certificate, this is definitely out there, open, public, it's in the CT logs, there's nothing shady going on. And to do that, we have to give the browser the SCT, because we don't want the browser having to go and check the logs manually. It introduces another performance overhead. If we give the browser the SCT, then we can satisfy its requirement for a transparent certificate. There's 3 different ways that you can do this. This is the one that I think 99.99% of websites on the planet will do, because it requires them to do absolutely nothing. This is how I think CT will come into existence, because most website operators that I speak to don't even know what CT is, and we were almost at the deadline. So you issue a CSR, you go to your CA and say, I would like a certificate for my domain. And what happens is, your CA will log these to the CT logs on your behalf. The technical name here is the pre-certificate. So basically your CA makes the entire certificate, but right before they sign it at the bottom, it's called a pre-certificate. And you could submit pre-certificates to the logs. Now the current requirements are that you submit to at least 3 different logs. This is largely just for redundancy purposes, but there's also a requirement that at least one is operated by Google and at least one isn't operated by Google, just to make sure we have some diversity in the ecosystem as well. So your CA gets this request, it makes the pre-certificate and it submits them to the logs. And of course your CA gets back 3 SCTs to say, I have definitely done this, here is my proof. And it then literally just pops those SCTs inside the certificate, signs it, and issues it back to you. So you now have a certificate with the 3 SCTs or more actually embedded inside it. You get that certificate and you give it to the browser like normal. The browser can extract those SCTs and make sure that this is a publicly known about certificate. There's no additional checks on the browser. It doesn't have to make outbound connections. It doesn't have to do extra stuff. All of the information that it already needs is in the document. And most website operators are probably going to end up using this approach, because most website operators don't know about CT, it seems. But there are 2 other ways that you can do this. If you don't want to completely trust your CA to get this right for you, you can take some extra steps yourself. The first of these is a TLS feature extension. Now essentially, this is very similar to what we saw with OCSP Stapling. So we go and get our certificate as normal. The CA will then log these, we will then log these into the CT log servers ourselves. So we can pick which log operators we want. We can have 3, 5, 10, 20, it doesn't matter. We get to choose and we log them. And we get the SCTs back. What we then do is serve those SCTs alongside the certificate. So just like we did with OCSP Stapling, you can give the browser some arbitrary extra document and say, here you go, like I've got some SCTs for you as well. The browser is still satisfied. The browser still got the SCTs that it needed to prove that this has been logged. And similarly, there's also OCSP Stapling. And this is exactly the same OCSP Stapling that we just talked about, except this time, when we get our certificate issued, the CA will log the SCTs inside the OCSP response. So we should already have OCSP Stapling enabled. And if our CA puts the SCTs inside that, we will issue the OCSP response with the SCTs embedded in it. Now, these 2 second mechanisms, don't worry about them too much. Most websites are probably not going to configure this or do it because it's quite a technical implementation. Pretty much all websites are going to depend on the first method, where they're embedded inside the certificates. But there are extra options there if you want to kind of control your own destiny. So that's like a couple of the larger issues fixed there. But we still have another kind of problem in the ecosystem, in that you can't actually say to a CA, I only want to buy certificates from Symantec, or I only want to buy certificates from DigiCert. Technically, any CA on the planet can issue certificates for you, and you have no way of expressing whether or not you actually want them to do that. So we need a way to authorize specific certificate authorities to issue certificates for our domains. And there is another new mechanism coming to do that, because we have our preferred CA like Let's Encrypt, but there's hundreds of other CAs on the planet, and all of them can issue certificates for your domain. And we need a way to be able to assert our authority. This is our domain. We should be able to control who issues certificates for this. So I really like this mechanism because it's kind of super simple. It's called Certificate Authority Authorization. It does exactly what it says on the tin, in that it allows us to authorize specific CAs to issue for us. And we do this with a really simple DNS record. There is a new DNS record, just like we have A records or text records. There is a new DNS record called a CAA record. And inside that, you can list the specific CA that you want to issue certificates for you. So for me, for my website, I only want Let's Encrypt to issue certificates to my domain, nobody else, so I put let'sencrypt.org in there. You may be a large website, you may have multiple CAs that you want to issue for you, that's fine. You just specify multiple CAA records. But these are now the only 3 CAs on the planet that you have authorized to issue certificates for your domain. You can start to assert your authority and your preferences. And this isn't just from like a bad aspect from a misissuance standpoint. Maybe as an organization, you have a contract with a CA that says, you know, we'll get an exclusive contract with you guys and we'll only buy our certificates from you. Someone in your dev team goes off and tries to get a certificate from another CA, they will block the issuance. They will make sure that you are compliant with your agreement. And you can also ask that the CA notify you as well and say, if someone comes to you and asks for a certificate for my domain, block it and tell me that somebody tried to do that. So you can also get feedback from them. This is a really powerful feature to have. And it doesn't really add much overhead to the system. So when we go to request one of our certificates, we send the CSR to the CA. And at that point, the CA just has to pause and just quickly check the DNS and say, am I authorized to do this? I need to go and check this CAA record to make sure I'm permitted to do this. Checks the DNS, looks good. I'm authorized to do this. There's your certificate. And off you go, using it as normal. So some of these mechanisms are really simple, and they allow us to assert a lot of control or authority, and we can get a lot of protection back from them. CT especially. Must Staple is quite young. I think we'll see perhaps Chrome starting to adopt that early next year. Once we get Firefox and Chrome covered, we're a large portion of the way there. They're the 2 of the largest browser vendors. I think they have like a 70+% market share between them anyway. But the problem still remains that right now, today, if you aren't deploying any of these mechanisms, then there's very little that you can do to actually protect yourself if you lose one of these documents. We're all in a rush to deploy encryption on our sites and to get more certificates. But if you lose them, if you have a bad day, if something happens, there is nothing that you can do to take that back. And what you need to ask yourselves, your organization, is if somebody did get a certificate and could prove that they were us, what's the risk? What's the harm? If you're a PayPal or a Facebook or maybe the BBC, that's a really bad situation to be in. So I want to leave you with the question, can you revoke a certificate? Right now, if you were compromised, if someone got into your servers, if the next Heartbleed came along and we had to do mass revocation, could you actually take back the trust in these documents that you have had issued? Thank you very much. I left time for questions. I hope they're awesome. Yes, okay, go.
So how will that work for people that have got, for example, an internal certificate authority that signs stuff internally? Will browsers still require these CT logs?
No, that's a really good question. So some organizations deploy their own internal private CAs. All of these apply to public CAs because they're the only ones that we care about. But they're the ones that we want to hold to this higher standard. If you operate your own internal CA, this all falls down to you as an organization. There was another one. Yep, we're there.
Hi. So one of the problems with OCSP Stapling at the moment is that support from Apache is
Yep.
down and falling. So
Yep.
how are we going to actually deploy this in practice?
So that's another really good point, is that there is a particular issue with Apache right now in that if it reaches out to do the OCSP request and it gets a bad response or a malformed response, Apache will actually cache that and use it and won't check. That's a bug in Apache, and we need to pressure the server vendors to fix their implementations of OCSP stapling. It is quite young, as I said. Firefox is the only browser that will enforce this right now anyway. I have several tickets open with Apache and Nginx to fix specifically OCSP stapling issues because I want to see people and websites deploying must staple. We need this feature. So yeah, it's still quite young. There are a couple of kinks. IIS, weirdly, this is the one thing that IIS is good at. So, Apache and Nginx need to fix their bugs. There's nothing more that we can do. It's down to them to sort that out. Yeah, the wonderful OpenSSL. Another question? There was one. Yes.
Given the state of play at the moment, so let's encrypt have much shorter expiry periods. So what's your view on people still issuing 3-year certificates?
So it was a really good question. It was about the life expectancy of a certificate, because obviously the point there was that the longer the certificate is valid for, the more of a problem you have if you lose it. If the document is valid for 3 years and you lose it in the first month, you're screwed for 2 years and 11 months. Let's Encrypt only issue 90-day certificates. So if you lose it in the first month, the attacker only has 2 months before it expires anyway, instead of 2 years and 11 months. And there are two different directions, the same direction, but two different things that we're looking at here. One of them is reduced lifetime certificates, which is where we can ask for things like 90-day certificates. And then the next step after that is very short-lived certificates, where we're talking about certificates that are only valid for 7 days. And the idea and the goal there would be that if we only have certificates that are valid for 7 days, we wouldn't care about revocation checking. And we could just completely skip it because the document is valid for such a short time. It's like, meh, we lost it. It'll be gone like by Tuesday. So the only problem is that the maximum age of the certificates is defined by an industry body called the CAB Forum. And it was 10 years originally, and every time they've had ballots, they've voted and pulled it down, and we're currently at 3 years. And there was a ballot earlier this year to pull the maximum down to a year, and all of the CAs, apart from Let's Encrypt, were like, nope, we're not doing that, and they voted against it. And we're currently trying to ballot to pull the maximum down to 2 years. But the industry body is slow to respond and to react. Most of the CAs act in their own commercial interests, and they don't want to pull them down. They don't want to reduce the lifetime, but we just need to keep pushing that and forcing it. As an organization, you can also elect to have shorter validity periods. If you don't want a 3-year certificate, you should never get a 3-year certificate. You should be thrown in the ocean if you get a 3-year certificate. Maximum 12 months, absolute maximum. But try and get it less than that. You can elect to have like 90-day certificates, and you've got a smaller window of risk after a compromise.
What's your view on domain name registration and typo spotting and things like that? So if I could go to Let's Encrypt and say, hey, please give me a certificate for something that resembles PayPal.com with some characters that may or may not be interpreted as a or a 0.
So that's another really good one. There's been quite a debate raging online about this, where if I get a domain that's like paypal-support.com, that's not PayPal, but it kind of looks like you could trick someone to think that was PayPal quite easily. And then you can go get a certificate and get the green padlock and HTTPS in the address bar to make it look more legitimate. I'm really caught up on this, and I completely disagree. Purely and simply because the job of a CA, when they issue a certificate, is to challenge you to prove you own the domain. That is a technical requirement. Do you own this domain? Yes, you can have a certificate. No, you can't have a certificate. People are getting really mad at Let's Encrypt because they keep issuing these PayPal-related phishing certificates, but nobody gets mad at registrars for selling it. Why did the registrar sell that domain? If it's a bad domain, why are we complaining about certificate issuance? It shouldn't have been issued. Why are DNS resolvers resolving it? Why are browsers opening the page? If we're pushing towards a 100% encrypted web, and we are, if CAs have other criteria for issuing certificates, they effectively become the gatekeeper of what can go online. They become powerful censors of the web. Their job is a technical requirement, and they have one. Make sure you own the domain. There should be no other factor in that, because if we get to a 100% encrypted web and they can choose who gets a certificate or not, they can choose who goes on the web or not. And that's really not a place I want a commercial organization to be.
Even if it's from a customer safety perspective?
I think that we should depend more heavily on things like Google Safe Browsing, which is doing a fantastic job. And the other interesting thing about this now, and I don't know why they're not doing this, is that some CAs already elect to log to CT. So if you register your brand new PayPal phishing domain and get a certificate, that certificate goes into CT. We immediately know that domain exists, and you've not even set it up yet. You haven't even got your phishing page in place, and you've just told us that your domain exists. So we could flip this around and use CT to find these PayPal phishing domains. Why are PayPal not doing that? Why are other organizations not looking at CT now and saying, oh, well, we've just seen this like substring of PayPal. What does this look like? This looks like a phishing site. We'll take some action about that.
Just a quick question. What happens when a CA, there's a fight between Google and a CA, where Google says, I'm pulling you, I'm not going to really want?
So there are a very strict set of guidelines if you want to become a CA. You need to go to all the different vendors like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and you actually need to apply to be a CA within their infrastructure, within their software. So you go to Microsoft and say, hey, I want to be a CA in Windows. You need to get into the Microsoft Trust Store. As long as you meet the criteria and continue to meet the criteria, then you are a CA. If you, as a CA, don't meet the criteria of that particular Trust Store operator, then it's at their discretion what action they take. We're seeing a big argument about Symantec online recently, because Symantec have screwed up like more times than I've had coffees today. It's really not a fun place to be. And there's been this big war raging online of should we distrust them? And the only problem is if you distrust the CA, all of their certificates become invalid, which means all of the websites that use them stop working. So they're kind of fumbling around and looking for a way of, well, we need to penalize them, but we don't want to hurt all the collateral damage of the sites that use them. It's still in progress. They've largely agreed on what the penalties for Symantec will be. But as I say, it's down to the Trust Store operator. If you're a CA and you want to get in the Trust Store, play by the rules. If you don't, something's going to happen to you, and you shouldn't then complain when it does because you didn't play by the rules.
Given the intense role of CAs in the whole process, do you think perhaps there should be legislative action taken to perhaps restrict which CAs are allowed to issue certificates for a given country and guidelines for that? Or should be entirely left up to the browser vendors?
Yeah, you see, anything that involves legislation in this kind of space worries me because legislation cannot iterate as fast as we do. Even in the industry we operate in, with the lack of agility that we have, we can still iterate faster than legislation can. So any kind of introduction of legislative restrictions concerns me because I worry that we may move faster than they can legislate for them. And it kind of ties in with what Ian said in his talk, in that the internet isn't like a country level thing. It's a global network. And to say, okay, well, you're VeriSign, you're registered in the USA, you can only issue certificates to .com. And, this Greek TLD can only have CA issues from it. I can't see that ever working, and I would hate for them to try because it would probably be an absolute mess. They're furiously waving at the back.
You've made no mention of TLS and things like that, which seem like an easy solution to all of these problems.
So, yeah, there was one of the problems that we have with the CA infrastructure is that a lot of people, there's like two different camps. We have CAs and there's an alternative called Dane and something called TLSA. And we looked at the CA infrastructure and the situation was either we fix it and make it better or we rip it out and replace it with something else. We are already quite a long way down the road of fixing it. All of the stuff that I talked about today was geared up towards fixing the CA infrastructure. The only problem with using something like Dane and TLSA is that straight off the bat it requires widespread and fully supported DNSSEC, which we aren't even close to here in the UK because Nominet don't seem to like DNSSEC. Countries like Norway, though, are doing really great. They've got over 90% of their domains already fully DNSSEC supported. The other issue as well is DNSSEC is controlled by governments, so the root zone keys are controlled by governments, which would have put Gaddafi in charge of the .ly root zone during the Arab Spring and stuff like that. And we're just taking one entity that signs something and switching it for another entity that signs something. So it doesn't really change anything. We just change where we're signing something. So it seems like a lot of effort to move to something like Dane and TLSA when it's kind of very similar to the PKI in that, not much is different. I do agree with DNSSEC though. It's DNS with integrity. There's nothing not to like about that. But DNSSEC adoption is terrible and continues to be terrible.
You have to question whether DNSSEC actually offers good security at the moment. That's the problem. It's not.
Yeah. And the other thing with DNSSEC is that we've already largely worked around the problem of DNS having no integrity. Like you do a DNS lookup, you have no idea what the IP address is, but you make a connection to it and ask for a certificate in the TLS connection. If your DNS has been spoofed, then they won't be able to provide a valid cert anyway. So we've kind of largely worked around the problem that DNSSEC fixes anyway. At least that's my view.
So with two quick questions.
Yep.
With must stable, what happens if the server can't get a response from the OCSP responder? So could I take
Offline.
Could I take loads of websites offline then by tracking your responder?
So,
Back to the soft fail problem.
OCSP responses are valid for a maximum of up to 7 days. So as the host, if you were OCSP Stapling, what you should do is if you get a fresh OCSP response like once a day, you could weather a 6-day outage of the OCSP responder. And CAs are mandated by the CAB Forum's baseline requirements to have 99.9% uptime on their responders anyway. So as long as you refresh at least daily, you can weather a 6-day outage of the responder, and that would be unprecedented if that happened anyway.
Okay, second question. You say revocation is broken, and that's kind of off topic. What do you think about public key?
So I was an advocate of HBKP and have been for a long time. It protects us against the misissuance scenarios. The only problem is I've got a couple of articles on my blog about things like ransom PKP and HBKP suicide. I think once we get to the point where we have CT enforced and mandated, and we have good support for must staple, the requirement for HBKP kind of fades away because we've now got full transparency in the ecosystem and we can actually take back the trust in the document. So we kind of won't need, I mean, there's still a technical use case for HBKP, but we're like 99% of the way there with these really easy mechanisms, so we won't bother with the really hard one for the extra 1%. Any more? Yes?
You mentioned earlier that you didn't want third parties knowing that you visited the forum.
Yes.
Is that why you wear glasses?
Next question.
Next question. Any more? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned on the second last slide about CAA that you have the authority check a DNS entry to see if it can issue a certificate to
Yes.
the domain. But how does this protect against an CA that deliberately ignores that?
So yeah, the CA is obviously required to check the DNS record and then respond appropriately based on what the record says. If they choose not to, if they disregard what it says in the CAA record, then that would put them in breach of the baseline requirements, which means all of the browsers could take action against them. So that would be a really risky proposition for them because the potential penalty for disregarding CAA would be loss of trust.
Is
So
the reason for the browsers not to do those checks when accessing a site that uses it?
yeah, because that would incur an outbound check from the browser, an absolute minimum of DNS lookup, and you know, we have like trillions of page views a day. That means like trillions of DNS requests. No one's ever going to like kind of create something that slows the browser down, because the browser would have to do that before it loaded the page, which means it sits in front of TTFB. No one is ever going to get anything approved that kills or has a negative impact on TTFB. It's just not going to happen. Any more questions? No, I think we're good then. Thank you.
Awesome.